bit of an intro in terms of what your brief was and then your discussions and what you're going to do next, okay?
Okay, so I'm going to start with our brief, which our title was Making Birmingham a Great Place to Grow Old In, Integrating Health and Social Care Services for Older People. Okay, so we've got a little bit of blurb here, and our basic take-home message was that we were to focus on early intervention for people who run into trouble. Actually, I need to backtrack immediately because one of the chief motivations for this is apparently that a lot of older people end up in hospital when they don't necessarily need to be, and bed blocking, to use the phrase from the media, is quite prevalent in Birmingham. So the idea was that we should focus on how to deal with incidents that currently end up with older adults in hospital when that's not necessary. So what we did, I think, was we tried to stick to our co-production action plan that we were given, and what we found, I think we had a very good and a vibrant discussion and really good contributions from everybody, and it seemed to turn out that in mapping it, we covered a lot of the issues that came onto later pages of our action plan. So we started out with, so I'm going to just go through the action plan pretty much as it's presented, because that's the way I've recorded it, and I think that's an easy way to understand it. We started out with our vision and aim, and we were going to take your own bed is best off our piece of paper, but then we realised that actually some people actually need to be in hospital because you don't have intensive care units necessarily in your own bedroom. So we modified the vision and aim to being something like optimise the occupancy of hospital beds, and so actually perhaps posing the question, which bed is the right one? So from there we set out, we went to the barriers and challenges, which seemed to be the next place to go because there seemed to be so many of them, because as Simon knows, who's working on it, it is a very complex issue, and it affects, it has lots of tentacles into all parts of the community. So one of the first ones that came up was rigidity of professional attitudes, which tends to be, and increasingly with litigation being involved in medical practice, the doctors, the specialists in the hospitals and the GPs alike are very conscious of being defensive in their approach and resorting to the medical approach for preference, because that gives them the greatest protection. So perhaps rigidity of professional attitudes. There was also as a sort of a balance to that is what the public perceive as being the right thing to do, and perhaps there's a lack of information and education of the public in that regard. Then we've got a big list here, another half dozen things, I'll just run through them. Availability of support for older citizens, lack of connection between different facilities and different groups of people, so that when we end up being unjoined up, it's a non-ideal situation. Another feature is common amongst older citizens is their isolation, which is very frequent and sort of happens without people really noticing it. Then with a little bit with regard to that, there are many different reasons for failure of family or community support and resulting in isolation, and these actually need to be identified and listened to and sort of understood. Another thing that happens and causes problems is that there's not really much provision in place for crisis scenarios where something happens late on a Friday afternoon or early on a Sunday morning, and everybody's just keen to do the quickest, safest thing, and that means somebody goes straight to hospital. And the final one on this list was a difficulty in, it harks back to the family support, that quite often families are either disinterested or they're putting their own interests first, which means that they are resistant to communication with other people who might be involved in the care an elderly person. So against that huge list of barriers and challenges, we then set out to see whether we could find strengths and resources. And again, this was something that when we got all these things, these actually fed into the later parts of the co-production action. So we found on our list that we had health and care workers in the community, which is a fairly obvious resource. We also could rely on GPs, police, fire services to come to situations where they were needed. Neighbours, faith groups, schools, local media, local retail outlets, the neighbourhood network scheme, which Jeremy knows about, the NHS. And Simon made a very good point about the local authority having people who service the community routinely and regularly, and like the refuse workers, like even the people who come and plant the trees in our street, for instance, they're out there in the community on a routine basis, and they're in a position to notice and possibly to be used by, if we get joined up communication, they could be a resource. So to measure our indicators of success, after some discussion about this, we decided that our best indicator of success would be lower bed occupancy by the elderly in hospitals. And we had various discussions about how that might be measured, which maybe we can talk about later.
We disagreed a lot.
Yeah.
You've got about 4 minutes.
Right, okay, so maybe, as I say, I hope that we've covered a lot, so I can skate quickly through the rest because they did come. So we then went on to focus on some of these things, so we've got a minute each on each of these, so tell me at the end of a minute. So for the focus bit with quick wins, costs and benefits. Quick wins, we thought that maybe communication between people would be something that could change quite quickly, and identifying the ways in which different groups could communicate would be relatively straightforward to put into action once it had been done, and we should be able to get information from the Central Commissioning Group and the primary care trusts about how things operate, which would inform our decisions and help us along the way quite quickly. We felt that the costs were not really relevant because they would make their own savings. All our efforts would make their own savings quite quickly, and we felt that everybody would benefit. That's patients, older people and their families, the service deliverers and the community. So then the last two things are the people who needs to be involved, and actually the only thing we added to our list of strengths and resources was the politicians, and Simon's advice on this was that politicians can be very valuable if you get the right person who has got the right, brings the right ethos with them. We felt that, so community assets, organisational assets, these were all things that we had on our list of strengths and resources. The NHS. 1 minute left. That brings me very nicely to the communication, and we actually initially came up with lots of methods, which I think many of us are familiar with from our other discussions: local assets directories, circulation lists, social media, GPs, libraries, targeting community groups. That's how to get our message out. And I've written down this, which the others can challenge if they like, as our main message. Too many old people go to hospital and stay there when it's not necessary. How can we improve this situation? We've had some ideas. Do you have any?
Brilliant.